Hello. If you will look on your desk, you have an agenda and a sign-in sheet. If you wouldn't mind, please sign in, and I will begin. I've been working for the last several weeks on my Master's Action Research Project, and I chose the effect of using multisensory techniques on sight word recognition. Sight words have been important to teaching students to read for many years. Teaching sight words begins in the early years. We usually start teaching our students either in pre-kindergarten or in kindergarten sight words. Some parents will work at home teaching them sooner than that, but in schools we do start in kindergarten at least. The research question I chose was, what is the effect of using multisensory techniques when teaching sight words to second grade students with learning disabilities? My rationale was sight words have been instrumental to teaching students to read for decades. The study is to determine the effectiveness of teaching sight words using gel bags, sock trays, or arm tapping. As you know, I'm in the Floyd County Schools District in Floyd County, Kentucky, and I teach at Prestonsburg Elementary. I chose to use second grade in the subject of reading. The length of my study was 5 weeks. This study will investigate the importance of sight words in the classroom. In order for a student to have success as a reader, they must learn sight words first. Reading has proven to be a difficult task for the majority of elementary students. Teachers are always exploring different avenues to help successfully teach literacy skills within the classroom. Finding the best approach to teach students can be a difficult task because all students learn differently. It is important to find effective tools and methods to teach students, especially those that struggle. It will also discuss how multisensory techniques can be implemented within the curriculum. Using multisensory techniques can give students that learn kinetically the ability to learn through the process of touch as they learn to read sight words. It wasn't until the early part of the 1900s that the recognition of sight words' importance came to light. Sight word mastery is believed to be an essential part of reading instruction. If students have mastered recognizing sight words, they will spend less time decoding words they do not know. When students are unable to read or unable to decode words, they are unable to read fluently and with precision. This study investigated techniques used by Orton Gillingham, a profound child neurologist. Dr. Samuel Orton worked with students that had reading disabilities in which he thought were caused by neurological deficits. Orton stated that the approach in education instruction should attempt to capitalize their auditory competence by teaching them the phonetic equivalents of the printed letters and the process of blending sequences such as the equivalents so that they might be able to produce for themselves the spoken for of the word for the graphic counterpart. This was found in literature by Ritchie and Goke in 2006. Anna Gillingham and partner Bessie Stillman eventually developed this type of instruction into their curriculum. My data collection. Using multisensory techniques was a way to incorporate methods of learning for my students that were tactile and kinesthetic learners. I collected data that was used in the study. Once analyzed, it was recorded qualitatively and quantitatively. Pre and post assessments, weekly assessments, and I used daily observations. All my participants were selected for this study was based on my class enrollment. Each student had an individual IEP with goals and objectives. 2 students were identified with an other health impairment. 2 students were identified with a mild mental disability. 2 students were identified with a specific learning disability, and 1 student was identified with an emotional behavior disability. The participants were 4 boys and 3 girls. I had 2 groups within my study. I had an experimental group that used the multisensory techniques during the sight word lessons. Students were given gel bags, and here's what the gel bags look like, and you have some on your desk to try. I made these myself with hair gel and food coloring, and all I did was buy these quart bags. You don't put a whole lot of gel or it doesn't work well. I found that out the hard way. And then I tape it so that the students cannot get it open and make a mess. So you just lay them flat. So if you want to lay them flat, and I will demonstrate how we use these. And you use it with 1 finger. And I would take a card. I would say brother. Then you write out each letter in your bag. And then you say, when you finish, you will say the word.
Brother.
Good job. I used salt trays. You also have these on your desk. And these are, I just bought Tupperware, not really Tupperware, but the cheaper version of Tupperware at Walmart. And I bought a container of salt. It uses just a little, you don't have to use very much salt, just enough to cover the bottom, as you can see. Now we'll demonstrate another word for you all to write in your salt. Page. Write the word. Now say your word.
Page.
Good. And then the next method was using the arm tap method. And with this method, you would use your arm tap, and we'll just use the word the. Now, the arm tap method is more the red words, which are words that you cannot pronounce phonetically. So I will demonstrate. You'll go the, T-H-E, the. Now you try.
T-H-E, the.
Very good. Now, my students in the experimental group preferred the salt trays as opposed to the gel bags or the arm tapping method. Some of them I had some left-handers, so that was, you have to use the opposite arm and go backward. So that was a bit of a struggle for me to try to teach as well. And then I had my control group. The control group received traditional lecture method of the sight word instruction only. These students were shown the sight words on the card, and I would say the sight word, wash. Then they would repeat the word. Wash.
Wash.
Thank you. So they did not receive any type of multisensory techniques within their lessons. My ethics. Throughout the study, confidentiality and anonymity of all participants was sustained by removing any identifiable information. I removed students' names from any documentation and replaced it with initials. All data was kept in a locked cabinet and on a password-protected computer that would further the security and confidentiality. I had each student, I sent home a consent form for each student to have their parents sign. When they returned the consent forms, the student signed them themselves prior to my study. The results statistically, I statistically analyzed the data. The results from the pre and post assessment show growth in both groups. However, the students receiving the multisensory techniques have shown more growth. And here is the pre and post assessment individual student growth. If you look, the blue represents the pre-assessment and the yellow is the post-assessment. And as you can see, this is in the experimental group. As you can see, there was significant growth on the post-assessment compared to the pre-assessment within this group. LA scored 24 points on the pre-assessment, and then on the post-assessment, 81. And this is out of 94. KB scored 33 on the pre-assessment, 82 on the post-assessment. BC scored 29 on the pre-assessment, 80 on the post-assessment. CP scored 69 on the pre-assessment and 94 on the post-assessment. So as you can see, all students in the experimental group did show growth. And then here is the pre- and post-assessment on the control group. It shows HA scored 27 points, or 27 correctly, on the pre-assessment, 75 on the post. BC had 31 correct on the pre-assessment, 69 on the post. JC was 61 correct on the pre-assessment, 92 on the post-assessment, and HT scored 42 on the pre-assessment, 77 on the post. There is still growth there, but it shows more growth when you do the means in the experimental group. So here is a comparison of the pre and post assessment on both groups. The experimental group, it shows that the pre-assessment was 40%. The control group was right at about 34%. The experimental group on the post assessment was at 89%, and the control group was at 80%. So there's about a 9% more growth by the experimental group that did receive the multisensory techniques. And then I did weekly assessments. And on the weekly assessments, I would pull students up individually. And I had them a sheet, and I had a sheet in which I tallied the scores. The students would say the word. They would either get it correct or incorrect. Now, according to this, here's all 5 weeks assessments. LA scored on assessment 1, 14. On assessment 2, 11. Assessment 3, 12. Assessment 4, 12. And assessment 5, 15. Each assessment had 20 words every week for a period of 5 weeks. KB scored on the first assessment 16, the second assessment 17, the third 15, the fourth 17, and the fifth 10. Now, during this time, KB had missed a couple of days of school, so there was, on week 5, he was a little lower on his assessment score compared to what he normally made. BC scored on the assessment 1, 17, assessment 2, 16, 3, 15, 4, 15, and 5, 12. CP on all of his, he scored 20 on every week. And this was my experimental group. And then this is my control group. It's the same assessments. Each student received the same words throughout the 5 weeks. Every week they received the exact same amount of words. Assessment 1, HA scored 18. Assessment 2, 14. Assessment 3, 13. Assessment 4, 11. Assessment 5, 17. BC scored 14 on the first assessment, 11 on the second, 18 on the third, 14 on the fourth, and 19 on the fifth. JC scored 20 on the first, 19 on the second, 19 on the third, 19 on the fourth, and 18 on the fifth. And HT scored 20 on the first, 20 on the second assessment, 17 on the third, 17 on the fourth, and 18 on the fifth. So as you can see, they averaged about the same every week for the most part. Now, when I compare a summative weekly assessments to the mean, my experimental group was at 62%. My control group was at 67. There was a 5% difference in that time, and that was, I had one student, like I said, that had missed a couple of days of school, and we didn't get to redo the words. So I think that that's what contributed to that. So my overall results show that the group receiving the multisensory techniques are performing a little bit stronger than the group receiving traditional instruction. The groups, as I said, were broken down into two groups. The groups receiving the multisensory techniques were cognitively lower than the groups receiving the traditional instruction. I chose my groups that way because I felt that the ones that had cognitively lower scores would benefit more by the multisensory techniques. All students were between the ages of 8 and 9 years old. Every student had an IEP for either a learning or a behavioral disability. And my interpretation of the data was I came to the conclusion that using the multisensory techniques during sight word recognition for second grade students with learning disabilities had a greater effect in learning. The pre-assessment and post-assessment data showed that both groups did demonstrate growth in the area of sight word recognition. However, the experimental group had better results. The total mean of the weekly assessment showed 5% more growth from the control group when compared to the experimental group. The results of the study show that the experimental group's mean increased more than the control group, which allowed me to determine that multisensory techniques had more success in sight word recognition. My data and observations also supports the results that using multisensory techniques are more effective than traditional lectures. This data showed that the experimental group was more engaged and on task during the lesson. Therefore, I was able to determine that using the multisensory technique had more success in sight word recognition. And when I was doing my observations showed that the experimental group was more engaged. I would use the sight word. They would write the word. They would even spell as they would write the word. If it was they would write T, and they would say each letter as they wrote them. Then they would repeat the word at the end. So if my actions were according to the results. Data shows that the students receiving the multisensory techniques showed more growth than the students that received traditional methods. It appears that the connection from touch helps the students with their learning. To share my results, as I have done today in our special education PLC, is one method I have chose to share my results. Another way is if we had either a district-wide or a school-wide PLC, I could share my results in that manner as well. I could call in each parent individually and discuss their child's success in the testing. And then, well, as I said, we could do it as a whole district. Do you all have any questions? Thank you.